Story number 01. The Fish Sauce Revenge. I still can't believe what happened today. It was around 6 p.m. when my father walked into my room. His face looked different, heavy, sad, like he was carrying something too painful to say out loud. He stood there for a moment looking at me. And then, in a quiet voice, he finally spoke. "Gina has about a week left." The words hit me like a wave, crashing down on me before I could even process them. Gina, our dog, my best friend. She had been with us for 12 years, my entire life. She was always there, always a part of our home. And now my father was telling me she wouldn't be here much longer. I stared at him, unable to speak. I felt my heart sink deep into my chest, and a lump formed in my throat. I wanted to believe that I misheard him, that this was just some terrible mistake. But the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I felt frozen, like time had stopped, like the walls around me had collapsed, and I was trapped in an endless void of sadness. He didn't want anyone else to know yet, not even my sister. She was still in the other room, happily playing with Gina, completely unaware that soon the joyful moments she had with her would be nothing but memories. The thought made everything so much worse. I wanted to scream, to tell him this couldn't be true, but I couldn't make a sound. My hands trembled as I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the tears, but it was no use. My vision blurred. I tried to picture life without Gina, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. How could I? She was always there, lying beside me when I was sad, running to greet me when I got home, resting her head on my lap as I told her all my secrets. She was more than just a pet. She was family. She was a piece of my heart, and now that piece was being ripped away. The house suddenly felt colder, emptier. Even though she was still here, I knew that soon I would come home and she wouldn't be waiting for me. Soon I would look for her and she wouldn't be there. Soon I would call her name and only silence would answer. My chest tightened, and I let the tears fall. I didn't care anymore. I couldn't hold it in. I sobbed into my hands. My father didn't say anything. He just placed a hand on my shoulder. A small gesture, but it made everything feel even more real. She was really leaving, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wiped my face and stood up. I had to be strong, at least for her. I didn't want her to see me crying. I wanted her last days to be happy, to be filled with love. I wanted her to know how much she meant to me. I walked to the other room and saw my sister laughing as Gina wagged her tail, her eyes still full of life, still shining with love. I swallowed the pain in my throat and sat beside them, gently running my hand through Gina's fur. I whispered so only she could hear, "I love you," and at that moment, she looked up at me, as if she already knew. Story number 02. The Spicy Justice Sandwich. My coworker kept stealing my lunch from the office fridge, even after I left notes asking them to stop. It wasn't just once or twice, it was almost every day. And it didn't matter what I brought, whether it was a homemade meal, leftovers from a restaurant, or even just a simple sandwich. It would always disappear. I started labeling my food with my name in big, bold letters, but that didn't stop them. I even tried hiding it behind other containers, but somehow, they always found it. It was frustrating, and no one in the office would admit to doing it. I was tired of spending money on food just to have it stolen, so I decided to teach them a lesson. One night I made a sandwich, but this wasn't just any sandwich. I layered it with an absurd amount of ghost pepper sauce, the kind that burns your mouth for hours. I made sure it was well hidden under the lettuce and cheese so it looked completely normal. Then I wrapped it up like I usually did and put it in the fridge the next morning. I waited, pretending to work while keeping an ear out. Sure enough, about an hour before lunch, I heard someone in the break room. Then, just minutes later, there was a loud choking sound followed by frantic coughing. Someone was desperately gasping for air. I looked up just in time to see one of my coworkers running to the water cooler, gulping down water like their life depended on it. Their face was bright red, eyes watery, and they looked like they had just eaten fire. I calmly walked over, took out my phone, and said, "Oh no, did someone take my lunch again?" They never admitted to it, but the stolen lunches stopped immediately after that. I never had to worry about missing food again. I even started bringing in extra snacks, just to enjoy my victory a little more. Every time I opened the fridge and saw my food untouched, I felt a sense of satisfaction. My coworkers started being more careful with what they took, and the office fridge was finally a safe place again. Looking back, I don't regret it one bit. Petty, yes, but oh so satisfying. And the best part, I still get a little smile on my face every time I see ghost pepper sauce at the store. Story number 03. The Neighbor's Dog Knows Something. I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood 6 months ago, hoping for a fresh start after a messy breakup. Everything was normal at first. Friendly neighbors, perfectly trimmed lawns, and the occasional barking dog. But then I met Mr. Grayson, the elderly man who lives next door, and his dog, Max. Max is a German Shepherd, and from the moment I first saw him, something felt off. He doesn't bark like other dogs. Instead, he stares. It's not the usual curious or protective stare you'd expect from a dog. It's intense, almost human-like, as if he's trying to communicate something, and he only does it to me. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then strange things started happening. One night I was taking out the trash, and I saw Max sitting at the edge of Mr. Grayson's yard, just watching me. When I went back inside, I swear I heard a faint whisper coming from the backyard. I brushed it off as the wind, but the next morning, I found muddy paw prints leading up to my back door. Except they weren't paw prints. They looked more like handprints. I tried to talk to Mr. Grayson about it, but he's a recluse. He barely leaves his house, and when he does, he avoids eye contact and mutters to himself. The few times I've managed to catch him, he's brushed off my concerns. Max is a good dog. He'd say he's just protective. But Max's behavior kept getting weirder. One afternoon, I was working in my garden when I felt that familiar prickling sensation of being watched. I turned around, and there was Max, sitting on my patio, staring at me with those unnerving eyes. I called out to him, but he didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, almost like he was studying me. Then, he did something that made my blood run cold. He smiled. Not a doggy grin, but a full-on, human-like smile. I ran inside and locked the door, my heart pounding. That night, I had a dream about Max. In the dream, he was standing in my living room, but he wasn't a dog anymore. He was a man, tall, with sharp features and those same piercing eyes. He didn't say anything, just pointed to the wall behind me. When I turned around, I saw a series of numbers scrawled in blood. October 31st, 23. I woke up in a cold sweat and immediately checked the date. It was October 28th. 3 days until the date in my dream. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I went to the local library and looked up old newspaper archives. What I found made my stomach churn. 30 years ago, there was a series of unsolved disappearances in my neighborhood. All of the victims were young women, and all of them vanished without a trace. The last disappearance happened on October 31st, 1993, exactly 30 years before the date in my dream. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My neighbor's dog is staring at me, and I think he's a serial killer. They'd laugh me out of the station. So, I decided to keep an eye on Max and Mr. Grayson. On the night of October 30th, I was sitting in my living room when I heard a noise outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw Max standing in my yard, staring at my house. But this time, he wasn't alone. Mr. Grayson was with him, holding a shovel. They both looked up at my window at the same time, and I swear Max's eyes glowed in the dark. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but before they arrived, I heard a loud crash from my backyard. I ran to the window and saw Max digging furiously in the dirt, while Mr. Grayson stood over him, muttering something I couldn't understand. By the time the police got there, they were gone, but there was a fresh hole in my yard. The officers searched the area and found something buried in the hole. A small metal box. Inside were photographs of the missing women, along with a list of names and dates. The last name on the list was mine. The police arrested Mr. Grayson later that night, but they never found Max. They searched the entire neighborhood, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. I moved out of the house the next day and haven't been back since. But here's the thing. Last night I had another dream. Max was there again, but this time he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by the missing women, and they were all staring at me, their eyes hollow and empty. Max smiled, that same human-like smile, and whispered, "You're next." I don't know what to do. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him watching me, and every time I close my eyes, I see that date. October 31st, 23. Story number 4. The Unspoken Bond. She singled me out, showered me with attention, then pushed me away, leaving me to pick up the pieces. This is how I reclaimed my power. When I first started working at the store, I could never have imagined that one person would change the course of my life the way this manager did. I had freshly turned 23 when we first met. For context, I am also a female. She was 31. She seemed like just another manager at first, but very quickly, she became an important figure in my life. Looking back now, I realize that the relationship we had was anything but normal, and it's taken me a long time to fully understand the depth of her influence and the damage she caused. I will admit it, I was attracted to her from the moment we met. She was striking, but it wasn't just her appearance that drew me in, it was the way she treated me. She gave me an unusual amount of attention right from the start, making me feel special in a way that no one else at the store did. Her compliments were frequent, and at first were professional and surface level, but gradually felt and turned personal. At first she gave me normal compliments related to work such as, "You're doing really well today, you have really neat handwriting, I like seeing you taking initiative," but then she'd gradually start saying things to me like, "You smell really good today," or "I love seeing your hair pulled back away from your face. I can see your pretty eyes," while simultaneously tucking a stray hair away from my face behind my ears. And she would tell me how cute I was with and without makeup on. Her favorite compliment to give me was her telling me how cute she found me. For a while, I couldn't go more than 42 hours without her giving me a compliment or calling me so cute. These remarks made me feel noticed, but over time, they began to feel like something more, something that felt more personal than professional. At first, I didn't question it. I liked the attention. I liked that she seemed to see something in me that others didn't. But as time went on, her behavior became more and more confusing. It wasn't just the compliments. It was the way she looked at me, the way she'd touch me when she walked by, the way she'd smile and sometimes bite her lip at me in a way that felt odd. She would touch me frequently, on my arms, my back, my sides, and even the nape of my neck, and when she wanted me to follow her somewhere, she would hold my hand. It wasn't long before her behavior started feeling increasingly weird, but I didn't know how to handle it. There were moments when she would drive by, touch me, running her hand across my back, nape of my neck, shoulders, arms, and sides as she walked by. Each interaction felt charged with something I couldn't quite name, but I knew it wasn't normal. I just didn't have the words for it at the time. It felt like she was playing with me, constantly keeping me on edge, making me feel special one minute, and then coldly distancing herself the next. Her touching me stopped for the most part when the pandemic protocols were put in place. One day, I was handling baby clothes on the sales floor and asked her where they should go. She looked at me, and instead of answering, she just repeated, "So cute. So cute," over and over again. At first, it seemed like she was talking about the clothes, but then I realized she was looking directly at me while saying it. Her tone shifted, and it felt like she was talking about me. It made me confused, but once again I didn't know how to respond. After I interrupted her repetitive response by asking, "But where do they go?" she snapped out of it and said, "Oh, just put them somewhere over there." I thought it was odd because she didn't actually tell me where to put them and just told me to find a place for them. She excused herself almost immediately afterwards, and then I went to find a place to put the baby clothes. There was a moment that had happened very early into my career, about 2 to 3 months in, that still stands out to me when I realized how much she seemed to be hovering around me, though at the time, I hadn't fully grasped the extent of it. One instance I remember clearly happened after my shift one day, during the winter holiday season, when I had gone to buy something on the first floor of the store. I wasn't wearing my work uniform since employees weren't allowed to be in uniform while making purchases, so I looked like any other guest, dressed casually in a bomber jacket. She was the manager on duty at the time, and as I made my way to the front of the store, she stopped me with a playful, cheeky tone, asking, "What you getting?" I told her what I was buying, and she let me continue on to the back of the store to get in line at the register. Since it was the holiday season, the line was long, and as I waited, I noticed her hovering near me. She would walk by, sometimes looking over at me, as though she was keeping an eye on me. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it felt like her presence was lingering. Then, she walked right up to me, put her hand on my shoulder, and physically turned me around so she could look at my jacket. She seemed excited, almost flustered, and exclaimed in front of all of the costumers around us, "I love it. I love it. I love it," before walking away, giddy and clearly delighted. Looking back, this was a moment that made me realize her interest in me seemed to go beyond the professional or casual. She didn't hesitate to touch me and physically move me, even in front of customers, as if it was perfectly natural. It was only later, after talking with a former employee, that I realized how much her hovering around me had caught others' attention. This former employee was one of the first friends I made at the store. We had met at the interview and became close right away. She told me she was sweet, but it was very clear that she was giving you special attention. We all saw it. I saw her drive by, touch you and hover around you often, and when she would always take you off the sales floor or bring you into her office, I always wondered what was going on back there. Something about you being overwhelmed, I think. Wherever you were, she wasn't far behind. Her words made me look back at all those small moments where she seemed to be nearby, and I began to realize that this wasn't my imagination. Other employees had noticed her unusual attention as well. In hindsight, it was as if she was always there, hovering around me and finding reasons to initiate these little interactions. I hadn't fully processed it in the moment, but her behavior made me feel like I was under a spotlight, being watched and singled out in ways that didn't seem to match the dynamics she had with other employees. Back on Black Friday in 2019, she had asked me where I lived, And when I told her I commuted from a nearby town, taking the bus from my local mall's park and ride every day, she seemed thrilled. She told me she knew exactly where that was, mentioning that she also lived nearby and had attended a local university. From that day on, she would regularly bring up and remind me that we both lived close by, almost as if she found meaning in the fact that we shared a connection to the area. It wasn't just a passing comment to her. It became something she loved to emphasize. At the time, I felt flattered, like this connection made me stand out to her. But looking back, I can't help but wonder if it was a hint of something more significant. From that moment on, I noticed that we were often scheduled to work together. Whether it was intentional or not, I found myself working with her more often than not, and every shift with her felt like it had an undercurrent of tension. When I first learned about her transfer to my local mall store during the pandemic, it struck me as strange and felt different from being just coincidental. During the pandemic, I also ended up transferring to the mall store out of convenience since it was so close to where I lived. I found out she transferred to that store before me after the fact. But her transfer there felt strange and out of place. She was the only associate general manager from the premier store, and yet she was moved to a smaller location. Other managers were assigned stores that made sense based on where they lived. Another manager was sent to a separate nearby mall that was near her home. The premier store even brought in other managers to fill the roles that she and the other manager left open. So despite her being stationed at my local mall, it was clear that the premier store still needed her, and her absence was significant. At the time, the general manager at the premier store was reassigned as a neighborhood store manager, overseeing the premier store as well as 3 additional stores. Because of this expanded role, I assumed the GM wasn't around the premier store as often as before, making the presence of an AGM even more critical to keep the premier store running smoothly. Her transfer to my local mall, then, didn't add up. As AGM, she was more necessary than ever at the premier store to fill in while the GM managed her other responsibilities. Yet, instead of staying where she was most needed, she was at the mall, my local mall, the same store that I had chosen to transfer to, and she got there before me. I wasn't the only one at the mall who seemed to think that something was off about her transfer, too. Another employee mentioned that the mall didn't feel like the place she was supposed to be. According to her and the rest of the mall staff, the mall was another manager's store. He was the ASM there and had previously been the store manager before she came in and took over. This employee even told me that she had mentioned she came to the mall because she knew people there, but she had given me a different reason, saying that the premier store didn't need her at the moment. Given everything, it felt as though she wasn't being fully honest with me. It seemed more likely that she might have chosen to be at the mall rather than being sent there out of necessity. This employee had later told me she noticed something weird going on between her and me, but she wasn't sure what it was. She just knew something was off. Knowing how she often brought up that we both lived nearby and that she knew I commuted from the mall, it started to feel like her transfer there wasn't just a coincidence. This connection she had always emphasized between us now might have seemed like part of her motivation to be at the mall. Her presence there didn't feel right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her transfer was less about business needs and more about something personal she hadn't shared. It was strange, almost surreal, watching her slip into my personal world so seamlessly at the mall. She wasn't just my manager anymore. She was suddenly interacting with people who had known me my entire life. She met my twin sister, my younger brother, and even my aunt. It was like my worlds were colliding in a way that I never anticipated. The strangest part? She was on a first-name basis with them. Hearing her casually say, "Hey, sister's name," or "Tell your aunt's name I said hi," or jokingly say, "Brother's name, have a wonderful day," felt like a boundary had been crossed, one that I never consciously agreed to. And then there was a former classmate of mine who I graduated high school with. She came into the store often because she and her family collect a certain item that we used to sell. The moment she learned she and I had that connection, she started treating this classmate with familiarity simply because of her association with me. I hadn't even realized how close she had gotten until it was too late. It was like she had inserted herself into my personal life without me ever letting her in. She just walked right in and made herself at home. And yet I never got that close to her world. I never met her family, her friends. It was always her stepping into my space, never the other way around. It made me uncomfortable in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. The mall had always been my childhood mall, a piece of my past, a comfort zone, a part of my home. But once she was there, it felt like she had claimed a part of it, like she had taken something that had always been mine and made it hers, leaving me feeling like a guest in my own space. Every time I saw her walking through my childhood mall, meeting my family members and family friends, former co-workers from past jobs, speaking to childhood friends of mine, and even my school teachers, I remember thinking, this isn't happening, this isn't happening, this isn't happening. It made her feel that much closer to me, too close. I never told her how uncomfortable, weird, and surreal it felt to me. She was my manager. I was her subordinate. We were at work. We were working. Technically, we were both supposed to be there. I didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't know if I should. So I didn't. Before this, there was the day of SantaCon in December 2019, a day that still haunts me. I was struggling with anxiety on the sales floor, so another manager moved me to the back to process mugs to help me calm down. She found me there, clearly noticing my distress, and motioned for me to follow her into the manager's office. What happened in that room is something I've replayed in my mind over and over. She sat on a filing cabinet, leaning forward, her blazer unbuttoned and her chest was accentuated, and her body language was just odd given the context of the conversation we were about to have about my anxiety. She smiled at me and asked, "So, what's been eating you? What's been making you so anxious?" Her voice was soft, almost teasing, and the way she looked at me made my face turn beet red. I was embarrassed, caught off guard, and unsure how to respond. I covered my face with my hands, and when I peeked out at her, she was grinning and giggling at me, and said with a sultry voice, "I love your nails." Everything felt so out of place in that moment, but it was clear she enjoyed watching me squirm. It was as if she took pleasure in my discomfort. This was just one of many interactions where her behavior crossed the line, but it was one of the moments that stood out the most. It felt like she was toying with me emotionally, pushing boundaries that I didn't know how to navigate. Another incident that has stuck with me happened when we initially returned to the store after being furloughed during the pandemic. Normally, she would take her break and eat her meals in her office, but on this day, her office was blocked off by boxes, so she sat in the break room instead. I was sitting further away, and there were other employees closer to her, but instead of talking to them, she turned around and struck up a conversation with me. We ended up talking for the rest of my break, and throughout the entire conversation, she stared at me intensely, following every move I made. When I got up to leave, she tracked my movements with her eyes and her entire head, not breaking eye contact. It was such an intense, visible gaze that other employees could have noticed too. This interaction left me overwhelmed by her attention. Earlier that same week, during training to reopen the store with new COVID protocols, I was in her training group. I must have made a reaction with my eyes that she noticed because she looked at me, giggled, and said, "Oh," when I responded with yes. She said, "Your eyes?" The other employees in the group looked at me, but I'm still not sure what I did that caused her to react like that. Then there was the time I was verbally harassed by a group of guests at the store. One of the other managers witnessed this and announced on the walkies that I needed to step off the floor to collect myself. She, hearing this, ran down from her office, that was a couple floors above, to where I was. She told me I ran down here as soon as I heard. "Would you like to talk?" I agreed, thinking she was going to comfort me about the situation that just happened. She brought me into the manager's office, but instead of comforting me about what had just happened, she turned the conversation into something entirely different. She told me I needed to focus on things that made me happy and told me to essentially leave her alone. I hadn't even gone to her. She had come to me, yet the conversation became about her needing space. It was upsetting and made an already awful situation even worse. One thing that really added to the emotional confusion was when she would say things like, "I'm very proud of you, I adore you, and you can trust me." She said it to me multiple times, and in those moments, it felt like she genuinely cared for me in a way that was deeper than a professional relationship. It left me constantly questioning what was going on. Was she my friend, my mentor, or something else entirely? I could never pin it down, and every time I thought I had an answer, her behavior would shift. One day, I was feeling nervous and anxious because she was nearby. I tried to avoid her, subtly moving away to recover an area of the store whenever she got closer, almost as if I was trying to subtly escape or run away from her. But she noticed. I saw her from the corner of my eye getting closer, and the more I tried to subtly distance myself, the more determined she seemed to catch up to me. Eventually, she caught up to me, reached out, and placed her hand on my shoulder to stop me. With a serious tone, she turned me around, leaned in close, and looked me in the eyes and said, "You can't run away from me." Her words sent a chill through me, and I felt trapped, unsure of what to say or do next. My mind must have blacked out because I don't remember what happened after that. As these interactions piled up, I started to realize that something was very wrong. I was becoming more emotionally dependent on her, even though her behavior made me feel confused. She had moments of warmth and care, but they were often followed by coldness and distance. She'd check up on me, offer advice, and sometimes even show concern for my well-being, like when she noticed scars on my arms and told me she didn't want me getting hurt. But then, She'd pull away or act dismissive, leaving me confused and hurt. These moments were confusing, but they weren't the only side to her. There were times when she seemed to genuinely care about me, and that's what made it so difficult to understand what was really happening. When I got COVID, I called the mall store to let them know I wouldn't be able to come in for 2 weeks. She answered the phone, and her response was comforting. She told me, "The first thing I want you to do is breathe. You are going to be okay, and I know you're going to come out of this just fine. I really care about you a lot. You are strong, and you'll get through this." Her words reassured me in that moment, and it seemed like she genuinely cared about my well-being. But even in moments like these, the warmth she showed was always followed by coldness. After I returned to work from an unrelated hospital visit, she didn't seem to care at all. In fact, her behavior towards me became even colder, more distant, and it left me feeling abandoned and confused. Her behavior wasn't just a string of isolated incidents. There was a pattern of emotional grooming, manipulation, and drawing me in with affection and attention, only to push me away when I got too close or became too dependent on her. I didn't recognize it at the time. The affectionate and close-knit environment at the store made her behavior seem more normal, which also blurred the lines further. Her cycle of hot and cold left me constantly questioning myself. What had I done wrong to make her pull away? Why did she seem to really care about me one moment and then act indifferent the next? One of the most painful moments came on her last day at the store. I had built up the courage to express my feelings to her, to try and understand what was going on between us. But when I finally spoke up, her response was brutal. She told me, "I want nothing to do with you and we will never be friends." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. After everything that had happened, after all the attention, the compliments, the touching, the transfer, the confusion, she completely shut me out. I felt abandoned, betrayed, and deeply hurt. After she left, I spiraled into a deep depression. The emotional roller coaster she had put me through had taken its toll. I self-harmed, and though at times she noticed my distress, her attempts to show care felt hollow. It was like she knew she had hurt me, but didn't want to take responsibility for it. I was left to pick up the pieces on my own, trying to understand how someone who had shown me so much attention could just walk away and act like none of it mattered. The reactions of my colleagues and managers only added to the complexity.